Chippy the parakeet never saw it coming. The problems began when Chippy's owner decided to clean Chippy's cage with a vacuum cleaner. She removed the attachment from the end and started sucking out the cage, and then the phone rang, and as she reached to pick up the phone, and Chippy was sucked up into the vacuum cleaner. And the bird owner gasped, and they put down the phone, and they turned off the vacuum and opened up the vacuum, and there was Chippy, still alive, but very, very, very stunned. And so the bird was covered with all this dust and soot, and so she grabbed and raced him to the bathroom, and she turned on the faucet full blast and held him under there. And she could see that he was shivering cold, and so she decided what any good bird owner would do is she would take the hairdryer and just blast that pet with the hot air. Apparently, Chippy doesn't sing much anymore. He just sort of sits and stares. But Chippy reminds me of the people that I know in life that just seem to have one thing happen to them after the other, right? Maybe you are one of those people who feel a lot like Chippy, and you're not so chippy about it. You've been sucked in, and you've been washed up, and you've had a hurricane blow over you time and time again. And the reason I mention Chippy and being sucked in and washed up and blown over is because it reminds me of what we've been reading in chapter 3 this past weekend, that John mentioned. For those who are new, we've been going through the story together. And you are more than welcome to go through it with us. If you don't yet have a copy, we have a copy in the back on the table there. We've also had some new bookmarks made with the timeline of what we're going through the story. So thank you for the volunteer that did that. There's also a couple of audio or CDs, not cassettes, CDs back there. If you need those and want to follow along via audio, that's fine. You can take one of those as well. But where we pick up this story this weekend in chapter 3 is with Jacob's family. Jacob was the son of Isaac, who was the promised son of Abraham, right? Remember, God is building a nation right now, and he's building this nation so that he can bless all nations. That's why he's doing it. And he chose these particular patriarchs, is what we call them, to do this. So here's a genealogy, just make it easier for you to understand. Isn't that easy? Just look at that. That's simple. You've got Abraham, who has Isaac, and he also has Ishmael, but the promise goes through Isaac. And then Isaac has Jacob and Esau, but, at one point, Jacob steals his brother Esau's birthright, so the promise goes through Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. I don't know if you know this, but Jacob's 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. That's where the 12 tribes come from. So you have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Say that 5 times fast. That's easy to remember, right? You all knew that, right? In fact, I think it's so easy to remember that I've asked, our young children, some of them hearing it for the first time, to actually recite the 12 tribes of Israel for us. Could I have the kids come up real quick? Just stand on the second row right here. We're going to sing a song. Come on, kids. Come on up here. Yeah. Woo. We're excited. Get to see how easy it is to sing about the 12 right here on this front row right here. Very good. You can, this is a great song that you guys can learn, and it just makes it so easy. Just stand right here. Yeah. All right? And so you guys remember this song from when Miss Priscilla taught you, right? Every single word, right? Here it goes. Let's go ahead and do that.
Look toward heaven and number the stars. If you are able to number them. Hey, Abraham, look toward heaven and number the stars. If you are able to number them, so shall your offspring be. So shall your offspring be. So Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And Israel had many sons, 12 to be precise. And they would be the fathers of the Israelites. They were Reuben and Simeon, Levi and Judah, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, Issachar and Zebulun, Joseph and little Benji. These are the 12 sons of Israel, God's promise fulfilled. These are the 12 tribes of Israel, through them God blessed the world. Now the 12 sons of Israel had 4 different moms. Times haven't changed, don't you know? They were Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah and Rachel. 2 were wives and 2 were concubines.
Worry about that later.
The sons were Reuben and Simeon, Levi and Judah, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, Issachar and Zebulun, Joseph and little Benji. These are the 12 sons of Israel, God's promise fulfilled. These are the 12 tribes of Israel, through them God blessed the world.
Excellent. Give them a round of applause. Good job, kids. Wow, they did such a good job. See, wasn't that easy, the 12 tribes? That was so easy to do. They did a great job. You'll never forget them now. So I know that we do have some new people in here, new to the Bible, and so I do want to try and make this stuff sticky for you. And so hopefully a little song can help with that. But yeah, there were 12 sons, and those 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. And the story this weekend actually focuses in on one of my favorite sons of Jacob, and his name, as you already know probably, is Joseph. Coincidentally, Joseph is also his daddy's favorite kid. He's his daddy's favorite kid. And just to show how much he loved his son, more than the rest of his boys, his dad makes Joseph this ornate coat of many colors. Some of you probably familiar with this story from the Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? Donny Osmond was the best, by the way. But it was a coat for a dreamer, because we learn not early on in this story, that Joseph has dreams. He's a dreamer. He has a lot of dreams. And if being daddy's favorite wasn't enough, Joseph starts telling his dreams to his brothers, and he tells them to his family as well. I imagine them telling it around the campfire. And in his dreams, his brothers have bundles of grain that bow down to his one bundle of grain. And then he has another dream where the sun, moon, and stars, they all bow down to him. And he's telling his brothers these stories, that your grain bows down to mine. Now, if you knew that your youngest sibling was daddy's favorite, that might irk you a little bit, right? But then to have this kid get better threads than you, he's getting the Jordans and you're getting the Kmart special, right? He gets better threads than you, and that he's telling you these dreams where you're bowing down to him. On top of all that, you may not have caught this, but did you notice that Joseph was put in charge of all of his brothers when they were out in the field? Joseph was administrator over them. He was in charge of them. Now that's got to cause some serious jealousy, right? And jealousy of others can lead you to do some really, really terrible things that you will regret the rest of your life. That's why James says in James 3:14, "But if you are bitterly jealous and there is selfish ambition in your heart, don't cover up the truth with boasting and lying. For jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you'll find disorder and evil of every kind." And that's exactly what we find here in the story of Joseph. I don't know what kind of frame of mind you have to be in to want to kill your siblings. Let me rephrase that. I don't know what kind of frame of mind you have to be in to want to kill your siblings and follow through with it, because I think we've all been there before, right? But Joseph's brothers were there in their minds. They wanted to follow through with it. Fortunately, cooler heads prevail, and instead of killing their brother Joseph, they actually sell Joseph into slavery to the Ishmaelites. Now, it's interesting to me because not only do his brothers disown him, but actually he's sold into slavery to distant relatives. The descendants of Ishmael are his relatives. They are descendants of Ishmael. The Ishmaelites are descendants of Ishmael. And so they sell Joseph into slavery for profit to an Egyptian. But not just any Egyptian. Joseph goes down to Egypt, and he's sold to a guy named Potiphar. Potiphar was the captain of the guard, which was really an important role in Egypt at the time. He most likely oversaw in the imprisonment of very high officials in his job. His name actually means the Bull of Africa. He doesn't sound like a super friendly guy to me, does he to you? But Joseph impresses him with his administration abilities. He's really good at this job that he's given. And so not only that, but these abilities that Joseph has, they're from God. And Potiphar can see that God has given him these abilities. And so it says that Potiphar, because he sees these abilities that he's given by God, he worries about nothing under the watchful care of Joseph. He doesn't worry about anything except what he's going to eat. And so Joseph was trustworthy in his work ethic. He was good at what he did. But not only that, he was actually very faithful in his tasks. He was very faithful. And so I don't know if you, like me, as you were reading this, if you got a sense of Joseph's character here. I really admire Joseph's character in this whole story. And one of the things I admire about him is his work ethic. Joseph is a slave in a foreign land. He is a worshiper of Yahweh God. He loves the God of his family, of his fathers. And he's been worshiping Yahweh God his whole life. And then he goes down to Egypt. He's away from his family. He's away from his God. He's in a different culture. And yet he doesn't change who he is. Because the reality is our circumstances can change, but circumstances do not make you who you are. They reveal who you really are. Let me say that again. Circumstances don't make you who you are. They just reveal who you are. I was just talking this past week to someone about integrity in the workplace, and it was someone who works in the shipyard, and there are all types of shipyard workers, of course, but this person was telling me their personal conviction that if they clock in 30 minutes later than usual, they will clock out 30 minutes later. Now, I don't really know if they get any work done in those extra 30 minutes that they stay, and don't clock out, right? But what I love is the fact that it was something they felt convicted to do, even when their boss wasn't looking. And I thought to myself, now, there's a Joseph spirit right there. You see, slavery didn't cause Joseph to give into the seduction of mediocrity. He could have said, well, they can make me work, but I'm just going to give them the minimum amount. I'm just going to do the least amount possible that I have to do in order to survive. Because a person of integrity is not someone where you have to constantly stand over their shoulder to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're not like that. People with integrity, they work hard and they work well. And they work to bless others. That's what people of integrity do. And that's because ultimately, Joseph wasn't serving Potiphar. He was serving God. And that is really the foundation of any biblical theology concerning work, is that, first of all, it's to God. Colossians chapter 3 says it this way: whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for people. And so Joseph, because he's a person of integrity, is going to work with just as much diligence for Potiphar as he did for his daddy back home over his brothers. Joseph was the same man in the workplace as he was in the bedroom as well. I want to explain chapter 39, verse 6. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. And so we learn that Joseph is well built and that Joseph is a handsome man. Did you know that only 3 people in the Bible are called handsome? There's Joseph, there's David, and there's the Jebusites, who are called handsome in the Bible. No, I'm just kidding. Joseph, David, and Absalom are called handsome in the Bible. And I think one reason that it's included here is because God wants us to know that Joseph is just a normal guy. Joseph is just a normal dude, right? He's got the same desires and attractions that a young 20-something man would have. And Mrs. Potiphar, well, I think she's a perfect example of this truth, that the Bible teaches gender equality, that women are just as depraved as men are. Women are just as infected with sin as men are and are in need of salvation. Now, Joseph, he had some reasons to say yes to this. Think about it. Nobody would know. There's nobody at the time, if you read the story, in the house while he was there. Nobody had to know about it. Not only that, but Mrs. Potiphar could make life a lot easier for him. And you got to know that he remembered what it was like to be the favored one back in Canaan, right, back with his dad. And she can give him that life back if he does this. On top of all that, wouldn't you be just a little bit bitter at God yourself in this scenario? Wouldn't there be a temptation to think that, I know what the moral code was back in Canaan, but if God cared about me, I wouldn't be here in the first place. So just say la vie, do whatever I want. Because you are never at a loss for ways to rationalize character loss, right? If you want to compromise your values, you are always going to find a way or find some reason to do that if you want to. But Joseph had some reasons to just say no. You see, he didn't want to violate that trust that was placed in him by his boss. He said, I can't do that to my master. I can't do it. You see, Joseph understood something that our culture denies. Our culture says that sex is just between two people, and as long as they're okay with it, it doesn't hurt anybody else. But Joseph knew better. He said, I can't do that to my master. But most of all, he said, I can't do that to my God. He said, I'm not going to dishonor my God. Because it doesn't matter if two adults are consenting, right? If God doesn't consent. That's the biblical standard. And so Joseph runs like a man. Have you ever noticed that Joseph keeps losing coats in this story? He just keeps on losing them. But the one thing that Joseph will not lose is his character. And so God blessed him. And because Joseph stands up and he does the right thing, he gets to go home and he gets to go back to his country and he gets blessed by God, right? No. He got to go to prison. The Bible is very honest. A life of integrity doesn't guarantee that there will never be misery. Joseph lost his job, Joseph lost his reputation, and Joseph lost his freedom because he wouldn't lose his integrity. Chapter 39, verse 20. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Have you also noticed that no matter where Joseph goes, people will put him in charge? You know why I think this is? I think it's because someone who fully trusts God can be fully trusted. Eventually in jail, Joseph is given the ability to interpret dreams. He can interpret them. And he interprets a couple of prison inmates' dreams. One of the man, he used to be a baker in Pharaoh's court. That guy, he interprets a dream he has and says, you're going to be impaled in a few days. And I guess he wasn't good at making sourdough bread or something. I don't know what it was. But the Pharaoh doesn't like him. He impales him. The other guy was the Pharaoh's cupbearer. He would bring the cup and taste it and make sure it wasn't poison, all that kind of stuff. And he said, you, in a few days, will be reinstated to your position. And sure enough, that's what happens. The cupbearer, then, he sees Pharaoh every day because he's the cupbearer, but he forgets about Joseph for a long time. Do you know how long Joseph has to stay in prison for after being falsely accused? He has to stay in there for 2 years. 2 years. He's forgotten. Until one day, Pharaoh himself starts having these disturbing dreams. And they are disturbing. There are 7 fat cows that he dreams about coming out of the Nile, being eaten by 7 skinny cows. That's just a weird thought, but it's a dream. What can you do? He also has a dream about 7 full heads of grain being swallowed up by 7 scrawny heads of grain. No one in his court, he calls all of his magicians, no one in his court can interpret these dreams. No one can do it. And that's when the cupbearer remembers Joseph. He says, I know a guy who can do this. And so they call Joseph out of prison. They shave him up. They clean him up, put on some Old Spice. And he gets before the king. And he interprets the dreams. And he says, 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. That's what your dream means, king. You're going to have 7 years of plenty, bumper crops, everything, and then 7 years of famine to follow. Joseph recommends that Pharaoh appoint someone who will administer the ability for Egypt to store up all the time that these 7 years of plenty are in effect. And so who else is chosen? But Pharaoh says, who's better than this guy? Who's wiser than this guy? So Joseph, you do that. Joseph is chosen to be this guy. He is made more powerful than any other person in Egypt except for Pharaoh. He's the second, he's like the vice president, man. He's second in charge other than Pharaoh. So Joseph gets to work immediately. And he gets Egypt to store up tons and tons of food for 7 years of plenty. And then the famine hits the known world. Egypt is affected, and so is everyone else, even people in Canaan, including Joseph's dad and his 11 brothers. One of them, Joseph doesn't even know was born, little Benji, as the song goes. And so they decide, go to Egypt, get some food from the Egyptians, because we've heard there's food there. The boys go to Egypt. Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. He's grown up. He's probably got the Egyptian get-up on, the makeup, all that kind of stuff, the headdress. They don't recognize Joseph at all, but Joseph is in charge of distributing all this food. And so when his brothers come to him, who have tried to kill him and have sold him into slavery, Joseph does what any loving brother would do. He starts to mess with them a little bit. He throws a couple of them in prison, accuses them of spying and stealing, but it was all really just a ploy to find out more about Benjamin and his father Jacob. And when he can stand it no longer, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers, and they are terrified, rightly so, because he's the second most powerful man in Egypt, and they are scared. But Joseph says these words, they're incredible words, Genesis 45:5. And do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. What we see here is Joseph somehow at some point in his journey, he caught a glimpse of what God was doing in his life and what God was doing through him. And it changed the way that he viewed everything. It changed the way that he viewed his brothers. At some point, Joseph realized that this actually wasn't a story about him. This wasn't just his story. Joseph wasn't the star of the story. God was the star of the story. And it was about what God was doing through his life. And so Joseph, I want you to see 3 things. Joseph put to death his desire for revenge. It's kind of like the grandmother that went over to her daughter's house for a visit, and the first thing she did was pull out a bunch of water guns, squirt guns, and she gave them to all of the grandkids there, and they squealed with delight, and they ran off to the sink to fill them up, and the daughter said to the mom, "Mom, what are you thinking? Don't you remember when we were kids? We drove you crazy when we were playing with those squirt guns." And she smiled and she said, "I remember." And the flesh says, "Get even." But for 17 years, Joseph has buried the temptation to turn his dreams into their nightmare. And they never knew it. They're thinking the whole time that they're there in Egypt, he's just being nice to us because Daddy's still alive. And as soon as Jacob died, their first thought was this: he's going to turn on us. Look at this, Genesis 50:15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. Joseph cries here. Why? Why does Joseph cry? Because he realizes that for 17 years, his brothers have been thinking the worst possible things about him. Doesn't that hurt you when you find out? When people have a choice that they can think the best about you or they can believe the worst about you, and they choose to believe the worst about you. For 17 years, they received his love, but they haven't trusted his love. They haven't understood his character. And I don't know about you, but that would have made me really mad. I probably would have made him grovel, you know? I probably would have made him grovel a little bit, because isn't that the way that we like to get even with people? People come to us and they're sorry and they ask for forgiveness, and it feels kind of good to make them feel bad, right? But Joseph buried that thought. He didn't go there. He buried the urge because he believed that God was up to something bigger than his own personal vindication. Do you understand that when you hold on to bitterness and you rationalize your desires to stay angry at other people, that you have decided in that situation that I can park in God's spot? But Joseph doesn't go there. Joseph says these words. He says, am I in the place of God? I'm not there. You intended it for harm. I'm not going to pretend that you didn't have evil motives. I'm not going to pretend that it didn't hurt. But God intended it for good, to bring about what is now being accomplished, the saving of many lives. So Joseph put to death his desire for revenge. Joseph also put to death his desire for entitlement. Have you noticed that Joseph is not a whiner while he's there? Even though for large parts of his life he faced trials that were unfair, they were undeserved, and frankly they were incomprehensible to many of us. Sure, later in life he could look back and he could say, now I understand what God was doing to me back then. But in the moment, he had no clue. He had no clue what was going on through him had anything to do through the dream that God put on his heart earlier in his life. But he doesn't whine. He buries the whole that's not fair mentality that people carry around their whole life, a lot of people. He says, you intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. You know, the hurdles of life's race, they tempt us to overlook all the ways that God has been so good to us in our lives, don't they? And so we go through a drought in our life and we forget that for most of our life, rain was normal, right? Or we experience a flood and we forget that most of life that we weren't in floods. Or we get disconcerting report from the doctor and forget that for most of our life we have enjoyed good health. We go through most of our life completely ignoring God's goodness and then get mad at God when something we don't like happens. Sometimes things happen that we don't deserve and we don't get it. But faith says, I trust that God is going to work this out in his time, and I'm going to surrender the arrogance that God has to operate his sovereignty in all the times and all the ways that I understand it and what he's doing all the time. I surrender that because I trust in his unwavering promise to save many lives. Some of you might know or are familiar with Corrie ten Boom. She and her sister Betsy were taken prisoners by the Nazis, right? And they determined that they were going to sneak a Bible into prison. This is back in World War II, of course. And they were able to sneak a little Bible, back into their prison bunks. And they were going to have a Devo every single day, and that's what they decided to do. And I think they pretty much got to do that. But they got sent to this horrible prison camp called Ravensbrück. It's overcrowded. It's infested with fleas. It's a terrible place to be. And they're reading from that Bible that day, that evening, when they're done with their work. That evening, in their devotional, they read these words from 1 Thessalonians 3, verse 16. Rejoice always. Pray continually. Give thanks in all circumstances. And Betsy said, we're going to thank God even for the fleas. And Corey said, no, we're not. I can't go there. And Betsy said, yes, you can. And they thanked God for the fleas. They didn't find out till later why the guards never interrupted their Bible studies and why they never made unwanted advances at the women there. It was because of the fleas. Betsy died in that camp, but because of a clerical error, Corrie ten Boom was released before the end of the war, and she went around all over the world and she shared her testimony, and she would often hold up this piece of embroidery, and she would show the backside, and she would say, life is often like that for us. It's a mess. It's chaotic. It seems to make no sense from our perspective. And then she would flip it over. And she'd say, but God is preparing you for a crown of life. And God sees what doesn't make sense to you yet. And I know that probably sounds a little trite coming from me. But when you survived Nazi prison camp, you've earned the right to say what she just said. That God is the dream weaver. He's good at what he does. He never promises that this would be easy in this world. He never promised it would be easy. But he did promise that it would be worth it. I want you to notice how Joseph finished, starting in verse 22 of chapter 50. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knee. And then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to you and your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Now, I don't know if you caught this, but what happened between verse 21 and verse 22, it's just a little tiny space in your Bibles, but it's actually 60 years in the life of Joseph. Just like that, he just fast forward 60 years, and what that means is that Egypt is now not only the home of Joseph and his family, but it's home to several generations of Hebrews that have never known anything but Egypt. That's all they've known. They were born in Egypt. They've known the Egyptian ways. That's all they've known is just this place in Egypt. And so you've got Hebrew grandfathers who have only ever lived in Egypt during this moment. And Egypt has been good because Joseph made it good by God, through God's help. And living the good life can actually be toxic to the dreams of God. And so faith sometimes meant, this is the last point, Joseph had to put to death his desire for contentment. And I'll explain that, because I think Joseph's last lap was actually his best. Did you find it interesting that Joseph was the first one to die? Isn't that interesting? He was one of the first of the 12 brothers to die. I think it's just so strange because he was the second youngest, right? He was almost the youngest, but he's the first one to die. It should have been Reuben or Simeon or Levi. But Joseph is the second youngest brother, and he dies first. The question is why. I think speculate, that God wanted one more opportunity to show those boys what real faith looks like. Out of all the things in Joseph's life that the Hebrew writer, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, many, many years later, of all the things he could have wrote about, this is what he chose to write in Hebrews 11, verse 22. It was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that the people of Israel would leave Egypt. He even commanded them to take his bones with them when they left. Joseph looked like an Egyptian. He talked like an Egyptian. He dressed like an Egyptian. He certainly walked like an Egyptian. He was buried like an Egyptian. They embalmed him. But his very last instructions, they were a rebuke to Egypt. Don't you dare put me in a pyramid. You put my bones in a sack and you take them to Canaan when you guys go. Because the good life we're having right now is not the promise. It's not here. It's there. And God is going to come to our aid, and God is going to keep his promises, and he's going to take us there to the promised land one day. And he buried the desire to be content in the place and the culture that was not the promise of God, that was not God's promise for him there. And that is so hard to do. And we're going to see that next week. In years to come, it gets real hard for the Hebrews. It gets real hard. And every now and then, they might walk by this coffin that Joseph was in, and somebody might say, "Who's that?" "Oh, that's Joseph. He once ran this country." "Well, why isn't he buried in a pyramid like all the rest?" He said, "Because someday God is going to come, and he's going to take us home where we belong." You see, I think real faith produces a holy discontentment in many ways with this world. The Bible says that we groan, not gripe, but we groan because there's a sense that our faith produces in us that says, this is not the promise. This is not the world that God has for us. Let me ask you just a really simple question. Do you really think you are going to find the life that you have always wanted at the mall? Do you really think that? You are putting your hope in stuff that's just going to burn one day, if that's where your hope is at. So it's so interesting that this powerful book, Genesis, it starts in the beginning God, and it ends in a coffin in Egypt. And you realize that that's the end of Genesis, but that is not the end of God's story. Joseph's life has ended. But God's redemption story is just getting started. And it's going to point to the best race that was ever run. Because God's story is not about Joseph or Abraham or Moses when we get to him, but God's story is about Jesus. And God sent this dreamer to foreshadow the Redeemer. Jesus parallels Joseph's life in many ways. And you will see that he is the star of this story because he would be the one who is going to be betrayed by his brethren, right? Jesus is. And yet he is the one who's going to save his brothers and his sisters. He's the one who's going to lead us to our true home and not inspire us with a sack of bones, but actually with an empty tomb. And he's the one before whom every knee will bow one day. Every knee confess, or every tongue confess that he is Lord. He has always been the star of the story. He's the star of this story. And that reminds us that we're not the star of the story. Like Joseph, you're in this story, you're a part of God's story, but you need a Redeemer. You need Jesus. And you need to bury anything that's keeping you from him. To die to self and to live for him. And for some of you, that means you got some work to do in your family. That you need to pray that God will give you courage to do whatever you need to do to end the war that's going on in your family right now. It means some of you need to stop complaining so much and be a happier, more joyful person in what God has given you to do. It also means for others that you just need to stop getting comfortable when all this stuff around us is just temporary. It's just temporary. But most of all, this means that we need Jesus, and that you need Jesus, And you can make that decision today. When we sing this closing song, I invite you to come up and make Jesus your Savior, your Redeemer, the one who you place your trust in, the one who will feed you, the one who will bless you, the one that will lead you into the land of promise. You can do that this morning in just a minute. Also want to offer up, if you need prayers, maybe there's something going on in your family, and maybe there's something you're going through, just, like Chippy the parakeet. You've been really through the ringer, and you need prayers. We have our prayer ministry, room 9, waiting and willing to pray with you. We have our elders who'll be in the front and the back. They want to pray with you. Whatever your need may be, we want to help you this morning. Come, respond to the message this morning, the story of Joseph, but really the star of the story, Jesus, who does all this redeeming for us. Come and respond while we stand and sing this closing song. Please come.